Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title, I am continuing my reviews of random episodes of Star Trek. Today we're moving from TNG to its follow-up series, Deep Space Nine. Before I get too far into it, just a reminder, if you want to support the channel, both the Patreon and PayPal links are down below. If you just want to do one-off support or make a one-off request, you can go the PayPal route. If you want to continue to support the channel monthly and gain access to perks like access to videos early and the ability to request topics for future videos, you can go to Patreon link. We have at least 3 different tiers there. Now, Deep Space Nine. Now, there is a lot to say about the background of this show, so I'm going to really just talk a little bit about it before I get into the first episode, Emissary proper. Now, one of it is the fact that this show's basic premise, especially in the first couple seasons, is strikingly similar to another sci-fi show that was airing on another network around the same time, and that, of course, is Babylon 5. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about that, and you could actually just do that as a topic of a video, and other people have, like Steve Shrives has actually done a pretty good video on it, if you want to check that one out. But long story short, it seems that Paramount was offered Babylon 5 originally. They declined it. And then later on, when they decided to do another Star Trek show, it seems possible that they had that treatment still in their files. And if you really want to go into the backstabbing world of Hollywood route, it looks like they did it to try to sabotage Babylon 5. Now, how much of that is actually true and how much of it is speculation and conjecture, we're not going to probably know unless someone comes out and goes, "It was me!" But it's one of those ones you look at from the outside, you're like, uh-huh. Not to say that it's a 100% copy, but the notes are pretty similar that you look at and go, mm-hmm. Now, of course, the producers of Babylon 5 never sued the producers of Deep Space Nine, so some people will try to go, hey, that's proof it wasn't a copy. Nah, just proves that they didn't want to take the time to sue, because it would have basically just been a waste of time in one regard, and that is it could have caused both shows not to air, and with all the time and money put in both shows, it's like, yeah. Now, I have not watched Babylon 5, even though I had heard of the name, so I can't really comment on it firsthand, but just from what I've read, you're like, yeah, that's a little weird. That being said, the reason that the producers of Star Trek wanted to get another show out is that TNG was doing good, especially in its mid-seasons, and they're like, let's do another one. Now, since they didn't want to have 2 shows about a starship traveling the galaxy on at the same time, they decided, let's do something different, and of course, I did the whole thing with the space station. Now, with the space station, you can get kind of a similar vibe that you could with a starship. It's just instead of you going to them, they have to come to you. And it also would allow for a little bit more of a serialized story format. More so later on, especially once we get into the Dominion War. But there's going to be certain arcs that they're going to allow for more continuity, especially when you compare it to certain parts of TNG, and definitely the original series. I mean, the original series characters and actors didn't get a lot of continuity until we got to the movies. If you know the years that the show was produced in, you can already guess right away that this was the main Star Trek show that was in production during my childhood. I mean, I was around at the very end of TNG, and I knew of it, but I didn't really watch it. But this, and a little bit of Voyager, and then of course later on in my adolescence, Enterprise, those were the Star Trek shows that if I had watched Star Trek as a youth, it would have been the ones I would have grown up with, but I didn't. Even so, due to gaming magazines, cultural osmosis, having an older brother, this is the one I knew of. In fact, one of the characters I associated with Star Trek, there were 2 main ones. One, of course, was Guinan from TNG, even though I didn't really know the character's name. And, of course, everyone knows Captain Picard. But the character from this show that I really knew of, just from the look, from seeing him in magazines, of course, was Armin Shimmerman's Quark. Come to Quarks. Quarks is fun. Don't walk now. Run! I love it. But, you know, didn't really know much about him other than the fact he was the bartender, because I didn't really watch the show. Although, from vague memories, I might have seen an episode or 2 just in passing, but don't really remember enough other than the fact, hey, there's Quark! Or whatever his name is. And, of course, going back and watching the Star Trek ones, I'm like, oh, it's this guy. Let's see how this goes. And, of course, couple years ago, especially during quarantine, I actually started watching through Deep Space Nine. Now, I didn't watch every single episode, but I marathoned the show enough to follow it. And I can definitely see why a lot of Star Trek fans consider this the best out of all the shows, or their favorite show. And having watched it, I'd say it'd be in the running. Now, I have not watched Voyager, have not watched all of Enterprise, haven't watched all of TNG. Watched a good amount of the original series, so I can't really say 100%, but just from what I've watched, if I were to say as a whole, yeah, it's going to Deep Space Nine. Now, in addition to the fact that set aboard a starship, another first for the series here is that our series lead, who doesn't become a captain until later on, Benjamin Sisko, played by Avery Brooks, is a black character. Now, Star Trek has always been progressive in certain regards. I mean, the first or one of the first interracial kisses on TV. With this show later on, we're going to have one of the first same-sex kisses on TV. But in one regard, having a character who is a commanding officer who is black, that is a big thing. Now, if they tried that back in the day with the original series, it probably wouldn't have floated as well. They might have been able to get away with it, but there have been certain parts of the country that would have refused to air it, just on principle. But in this time, it works. And I know there's going to be some people that go, oh, well, why are we bringing that up? It's like, because for people in certain areas, and also, of course, if you are of certain ethnicities, it is important. I mean, there are some times where you can just watch a character and it can be universal. But then other times you watch it and you go, you can tell it's like, it connects with you a bit more because of that. Now, I'll say I really did like a lot of superhero films and stuff they were produced when I was a kid, but if there's one that really connected with me a lot when it came out, it was The Mask of Zorro. And why? Because it was a Hispanic pop character. And it's the same thing with the Irish stuff. A lot of the Disney films I saw that involved Ireland I really connected with, so going with both sides of my family there. So with this one, Benjamin Sisko, played by Avery Brooks, probably connect with a lot of people, of African American heritage. Now, obviously, I think you could tell from looking at me that I am not black, so I cannot 100% speak for the black community. But just from my own experiences and seeing how it is progressive, I could see how like a lot of kids growing up with the show could be connected with Benjamin Sisko and be like, I could be like him. You know, like, maybe not 100% like that, but, really live vicariously through him and actually be inspired by the character. And of course, like I said at the top of this, it's another example of Star Trek being progressive. Now, whether you think it's good progressive or bad progressive, that's going to be on you, because there can be both. There's one where you could put it in there and you're doing it to kind of make a statement, but it's not at the expense of the show and the writing. And other times where you're doing it that way, and because the writing isn't 100% on point, it comes across as a little forced. Here, with Cisco, I think it's on point. And of course, Avery Brooks does a great job, especially later, other points where he lets loose and is very, very theatrical. You betrayed your uniform! We'll talk about that moment, of course, when we get to that episode. But he is on point. One thing I have to mention, of course, about Brooks' casting is that it was in his contract that he had to have his hair and he had to be clean-shaven to avoid comparisons with his past character, Hawk. Now, of course, once Cisco was established around the end of Season 3, beginning of Season 4, he was allowed to go back to his typical look. I put bear here as like, yeah, regrow his bear. I forgot to put the D in my notes. Yeah, of course, because we all know it's always good when you can regrow your bear. The director is David Carson, and he does a pretty good job here directing the pilot, and because it is an extra-length episode, it is essentially like a mini made-for-TV movie. In syndication, they split it in half, but of course, you watch on Netflix, on Hulu, I'm going to guess also Paramount Plus, it is going to be one full episode, so you don't have to worry about that. Now, Carson, he handles the TV budget pretty well here, and like with TNG's pilot, there's a little bit more special effects here. The only difference is, whereas TNG has actually had the HD treatment, with the Deep Space Nine, it is still in full definition, even on stuff like Netflix. Now, Carson has directed past stuff with Star Trek. He directed a few episodes of TNG, the standout one by name, of course, being Yesterday's Enterprise. He would later go on to direct episodes of Smallville. And in addition to this episode with Deep Space Nine, he also directed Dax. And, of course, the infamous episode, Move Along Home, which I'm just going to be honest, when I first watched that one, I thought, it's an okay episode. I didn't really know that episode was much maligned and hated in the fandom until I actually started watching Lore Runner stuff and then reading some stuff. I'm like, okay, I could kind of see it. Count to 4. You bring that up around Brooks, I guess he kind of has a conniption fit. Of course, Michael Piller, one of the series creators, wrote the teleplay, and the score for this episode, in addition to 77 others, was done by Dennis McCarthy. He also did the score for Star Trek Generations, which is kind of a nice little connection there, because Carson also directed Star Trek Generations. And, of course, McCarthy also did the Scorpion King, among others, so nice little bit there. And that main score he does really does fit the spirit and adventure of Star Trek, while going with the different type of direction, and the whole thing with the wormhole with the Deep Space Nine setting, it really does add to it. It's one of those openings you don't want to skip. And if it's an opening like that, you know it's good. Now, of course, there'll be times where, I don't want to listen to it today, where you got to skip through it because you want to get to the heart of the story, especially if the opening prologue hooks you. Now, Emissary's plot, of course, being the pilot of a series, it's got to really sell the specific aspects of the story. Now, the prologue for this one picks up on a moment that we had heard about years before, but we weren't able to see, and that, of course, is the Battle of Wolf 359. One of the battles from the best of both worlds, where we see Picard as Locutus of Borg give his speech, "Resistance is futile." And, of course, they try to valiantly fight the Borg and aren't able to. Now, of course, Cisco and his wife and their young son are aboard one of the ships. And Cisco's wife dies in the ensuing attack. We actually do see him try to save her, and Brooks plays this pretty well. You do believe he is a spouse trying desperately to save his wife, and then the look on his face. And a lot of the rest of the episode with his arc deals with him not only coming to terms with his new post, but trying to let go of that aspect of his past, especially since in 2 scenes he does have to meet Picard. Now, we, the audience, know this is not the same Picard that attacked him. He was Borgified when he did that. So this is Picard, not Locutus, he's going up against. But he doesn't see the difference, and you could tell with the way that Brooks is selling it in both the look on his face, the way he's just mad-dogging Picard, and, of course, in the inflections of his voice. And to add to it, the way that Patrick Stewart sells it when he finds out where him and Cisco met before, he's like, oh, yeah, this guy hates me. But he's still respectful as a Starfleet captain, serving the tea and all that, trying to get him acclimated to his new post. Which Cisco is not excited about the post at first, but he still runs Deep Space Nine to the best of his ability. Because he's established there once the Cardassians leave Bajor. And of course, they kind of leave the station a mess when they leave. Now, one thing that they don't really touch on a lot in this episode, but is very, very hinted at and set, and the groundwork is set for it, but it's brought up in later episodes throughout the show, is that the Cardassian occupation of Bajor is, in a comparison a lot of other Star Trek YouTubers have made, is Star Trek's version of the Holocaust. Which, of course, the Cardassians being Nazi Germany, and the Bajorans being both the Jews, homosexuals, and every other group that the Nazis persecuted against. Even down to camps and senseless murder. The foreshadowing for that revelation as the show goes on is very subtle in this episode, but it is there, especially if you know about it. You're looking at it. It's mainly in the way that Major Kira, played by Nana Visitor, plays in a lot of the scenes. Like, she doesn't want the Federation there. Just the way she scolds Dr. Bashir when he says his thing about frontier medicine. And a lot of other things. You can definitely tell it's there. And then, of course, also bringing the Bajoran religion into the forefront. I don't know if that many people have brought up that little connection there, but it is there. And, of course, you can have the thing that the Cardassians hated the Bajoran religion with the Kais and the Paws inside somebody. Which ties into the fact that this is called Emissary, because that is going to tie into Star Trek's first little foray into the world of religion in a more serious but respectful manner. Now, as he gets there, Cisco meets all the people. He meets Major Kira, his first officer. He meets Odo, who is the constable, played by Rene Auberjonois. And he grows more as the series goes on, especially since he becomes important when we get into the Dominion story arcs. Odo here, he's nothing more than the gruff cop, but he has room to grow. I mean, the pilot episode is for setting up what the characters are and who their archetypes are. Alexander Siddig later as Dr. Bashir. Love him. Of course, he is a little bit of a... trying to find a nice word to describe Dr. Bashir. I'd say he's a little annoying. He's full of himself here. He grows out of that as the series goes on. But as what we find out later, it could be a smoke. But that'd be an example of them turning something that they originally did into something later. Because I'm sure we all know that, to steal another loreism, Star Trek is more about backdoor writing, not front door writing. If you want to know what the difference of that is, it's you write as you go and not as you do. So it's basically they're Gardner writers and not architect writers. They're going to let it go and then go with it. Of course, Terry Farrell as Jadzia Dax, excellent. And of course, Armin Shimmerman as Quark. We're introduced to all of them in due time. We're reintroduced to Colin Meaney as Chief O'Brien, which, like Worf was later, he was brought in to try to spruce up the show with a TNG crossover outside, of course, Picard appearing in the pilot as kind of a passing of the torch show-wise. And I thought it would help with the ratings. And they also thought Meaney was too talented to confine his character to a transporter room. But the only request he really made after he accepted, even though he was initially reluctant to sign on to the show, was he wanted his uniform to have pockets and a roll-up sleeves. The main reason for that is that he thought, well, Miles O'Brien is a chief petty officer. He is a senior non-commissioned officer. And unlike the officers, a non-com is a working man. So he's going to need that. I used to work for a living. That whole little joke there. Of course, Mark Alimo was Gul Dukat, a recurring antagonist on the show. Also played one of the first Cardassians. Aaron Eisenberg, may he rest in peace, as Nog. Max Grodenchik. Now, he's only credited in this episode as the Ferengi pit boss, but we know from how the show expands on his character later, he's going to be Rom. He just doesn't have a lot of the mannerisms and the voice. Don't allow doubt to tarnish the lust for platinum. Talking like that. That's not established till later. Now, as the episode goes on and Cisco meets and interacts with a lot of these characters, he has to figure out, okay, I got to keep people from leaving Deep Space Nine, which leads to him blackmailing Quark because of a little situation Nog gets involved with. He meets with the Kai of Bajor and learns a little bit about their religion. I actually forgot about this aspect of the pilot. So going back, like, oh yeah, I forgot they established that early on. So nice little thing there. He finds out about the orbs. Now, because of what he learns about the orbs randomly appearing, he has Lieutenant Dax, who we find out he actually has a past with because of the fact that the Trill are a symbiotic species. He was friends with Dax's previous host, Curzon, which of course leads to the little back and forth, and of course Sisko's little joke nickname for Jadzia, Old Man. And that even continues later on when they replace Jadzia with Ezri. It kind of goes into the whole thing from Avatar The Last Airbender, can a friendship last more than one lifetime? When it comes to a Trill, I'd say yeah. Now if it's one Trill knowing another Trill that they're joined and they're not in a romantic relationship, that's going to be a little bit more loosey-goosey. But when it comes to a non-Trill and a Trill being friends, going from one host to another, yeah, it looks like that could happen. As I was saying though, he has Jadzia do a scan of the area and they find what turns out to be the Bajoran wormhole. And then there's a whole little fight between the station and the Cardassians over that, which is their first little spat that's going to continue on and off throughout the show. Now, Cisco makes contact with the wormhole he goes through, which takes him to the Gamma Quadrant, which, of course, if you don't know how the layout of the universe, that's a long way from where they are at Bajor. So it's a wormhole, stable, permanent, that they can use to circumvent all the long distance. Which, of course, later on, this led to one question about Voyager, like, why did they just shoot for the other end of the Bajoran wormhole? Because it'd be, one, because the showrunners didn't want that crossover, and two, it probably would have been more trouble than it was worth. You might have encountered worse threats there, but having not watched Voyager, I can't 100% comment on it, but like the one at the top about this show being a potential ripoff, there are a lot of videos dedicated to why Voyager didn't shoot for the wormhole. But on their way back through the wormhole, Cisco encounters the prophets, or as other people would call them, the wormhole aliens, who are non-linear beings, which means that they don't see time the way we do, where 1 second goes into another, 1 minute, seconds become minutes, minutes become hours, hours become days, etc. They see everything at once. So one of Cisco's first little problems is he has to explain the concept of linear time to these aliens. And the fun thing about this is that they use his memories to take physical form to interact with him. So he's seeing the aliens as his loved ones, both his wife, his son, other people he knows. So interacting with them is interesting, and all the actors that play them, especially since we get to see Picard thrown in there again. Excellent. They all play it beautifully. Cisco has to explain linear time, that most of them are not a threat, that they live their lives, especially the Federation people, in the service of improving themselves, and that he's not a threat to them. And it just goes on. Eventually he does get through to the prophets that they're not a threat, and they do allow them and the Cardassians, led by Dukat that snuck in, out. And from here, Cisco is now going to be the emissary of the prophets. So he's a religious figure. So you can imagine going forward, there's going to be a lot of Bajorans that are going to hold him in reverence. And this whole thing of him being the emissary is going to continue forward, and it will become a crucial plot element at times, especially in the finale when he has his final showdown with Dukat. But for here, they establish it. So in the future episodes, when he becomes revered, don't be surprised. Now, the reason I decided to do Emissary after I did Last Outpost was mainly due to the Ferengi connection. Because we go from the episode that established the Ferengi to the episode that helped save the Ferengi. Because on TNG, after Last Outpost, the Ferengi were basically a joke. Like I mentioned in my review for that, I took them seriously when we saw them on the view screen, but it was when they actually appeared in person. That's when they kind of fell apart for me. Even having watched the show first and go back and watching it, I'm like, yeah, I can see why fans didn't like them. Now, for a few episodes, they are considered a serious threat, but then later, to steal a Shrivism, the showrunners steered into the skid and basically made them comedy-esque characters. Now, for Deep Space Nine, they are still seen as comedy characters at times, but they are salvaged slightly, thanks in part to Armin Shimmerman. Since he played one of the first Ferengi, he felt it was his duty to try to salvage them, and that's what they do here. You will not see Quark doing any of that, well, what they have done type of mannerisms. He's basically a humanized character, and Armin plays Quark excellently. Just the way he says his lines, like him laughing when he hears that Cisco wants him to be a community leader, which is why he blackmails him to keep people on the station. His interactions with the other people at the bar, especially in later episodes. Excellent. And of course, Quark does get episodes dedicated to him. House of Quark comes to mind. Who Mourns for Morn, among others. It's just excellent performance. And of course, later on, Max Grodenchik also does it a little bit too, but his is a little different, because by the time that he starts to get a little bit more growth as Rom, and also Aaron Eisenberg as Nog, the show has been on for a while, we know these characters, so they start to expand. And the show, and all these actors, also help expand the lore with the Ferengi, more than just greedy capitalist analogs. Which, of course, the next episode I plan on reviewing after this is really going to tie into that, because that one really grows the lore around the Ferengi, but I'm skipping ahead with that. We'll talk about that when we get to that episode. Like, all in all, this is a good pilot. I'm going to talk about some trivia now. Now, with the character of Odo, he was envisioned as a Clint Eastwood type, so when Renee auditioned for it, he was told that the previous actors weren't grouchy enough, so he improvised some lines using his most gravelly voice, and the rest is history. And just the way he scoffs at stuff, like, I guess Renee Auberjonois hated that so much, but it fits the character. Now, the character of Major Kira was originally supposed to be Ro Lauren, a Bajoran character from TNG, but her actress Michelle Forbes turned it down because she didn't want to commit to a long-running show, so they had to rewrite the character, which is a shame because part of the reason they wanted to revisit Bajor was her character, so it is what it is. With the Trill, they kind of toned down a little bit on how they had done the symbiosis before, where I haven't seen this episode, but from what I've read, I guess the symbiosis before was more like the Trill took 100% control, whereas in this episode and going forward, it's more like a partnership one where once you join, it's like your personalities mold together. And you get the memories and experiences from each other. But also the design was changed. Before it was prosthetics. They changed it to makeup dots because the producers felt Farrell was too attractive to cover up in all the prosthetics. Which I kind of see why. It is played to its advantage several times, especially later on when Jadzia is flirting with Worf. And Michael Westmore, the head makeup artist, it took him over an hour to apply them directly. Of course, Marco Lamo, he was called the Neck due to his unusually large neck. Now, as I've already mentioned before, Star Trek series have dealt with complex social issues, but Deep Space Nine took it a step further, having darker undertones, and seriously dealt with genocide, terrorism, bigotry, PTSD. Now here, Cisco deals with that, and in his dealings with the wormhole aliens, part of the reason he's able to get them to understand everything is because they keep seeing that he lives in the moment his wife dies. Now, he never fully gets over it, but they do help him come to terms with it. And that whole scene of you live here, it definitely brings up it definitely will connect with someone who has traumatic moments in their life that keep, for lack of a better term, dictating their life. So for him, he does get over it. So it's nice for them to touch on that. Later episodes will deal with more PTSD. Like I mentioned, the whole thing with genocide with the Bajorans. Obviously, there's going to be some terrorism when they go and talk about the occupation. Bigotry. Oh yeah, there's going to be some of that. And of course, due to the static nature of the space station, it was easier to have the characters deal with long-term consequences like I mentioned. More of that's going to be later, but it is there. Now, funny thing is, Quark's prosthetic nose, you notice, is different in this episode and later episodes, but that's because the one that they were making for Armin Shimmerman wasn't ready in time, so they had to use one of Rom's. It is what it is. Now, here's a funny thing, is that J.G. Hertzler, who would later play the recurring character of Martog and even played another couple one-off characters like the Changeling that Odo meets later, in, I think it's Chimera. He appeared as a Vulcan captain in one of the scenes, so nice little use of actor there. Now, for the lead role, apparently Carl Weathers at one point read for the role, which that would have been interesting to see if he had actually been on, but they didn't get him. I guess there was something about his reading they didn't like, but that would have been a different character, but interesting to watch, just like these next two people that, according to IMDb, were offered the role. Tony Todd and James Earl Jones. Now, Todd definitely would have been interesting with that voice. James Earl Jones, they've had to make Cisco a bit older because of how old Jones was at this point, but I could imagine, like, there's a lot of moments with that booming basso voice of his I can imagine him doing. Like the line I quoted earlier about betraying the uniform. I can imagine Jones yelling that pretty easily. You betrayed your uniform! And then all of his bass lines. Of course, there would have been some people going, yeah, I don't want Star Trek to mix with my Star Wars. But it would have been interesting. Character would have been different, but it would have been interesting. Now, a nice little musical segue is when O'Brien beams to Deep Space Nine and the camera pans to show the Enterprise departing. It segues from the classic Star Trek fanfare into the Deep Space Nine theme, so I really got to give that an applause. That's a nice little passing of the torch moment there. Now, this is the first Star Trek episode that does not begin with the traditional Final Frontier monologue, but it makes sense. They don't have the same type of mission at Deep Space Nine, so that whole monologue would be redundant. Now, this is one thing long-term show watchers will notice. Sisko speaks about his father in the past tense, hinting he has passed away, but he would later appear in Season 4. Now, it's one of those things like, ooh, did they mess up? Possibly. But it also could be a little thing of going with, well, when he spoke about his father, he said that he was a gourmet chef. Well, it could be that he switched from being a gourmet chef to just being the Creole chef in a small restaurant by this point. So he is technically no longer a gourmet chef. So past tense would be apt. And now, this episode specifically was nominated for a couple technical Emmys at the 1993 Emmys, and it won the one for special effects, which I gotta applaud because there were 250 special effects created for this episode, and it deserved it for Odo's changeling transformation alone. But when you put it all together, oh yeah. The nominations it got were for sound mixing and sound editing, and when you listen to the sound, you're like, oh yeah, I could see why they decided to give it. There were a couple other episodes this season that got nominated, but since they're not involved with the pilot, I'm not going to talk about it. All in all, Emissary is a very good pilot. Sets up what Deep Space Nine is going to be about, introduces the characters pretty well, starts the beginning of certain arcs, Cisco being the emissary of the Prophet, Odo not understanding who he is, the whole thing with Major Kira trying to soften up, Gul Dukat and his little back and forth tete-a-tete with Cisco, introduces the Ferengi in a new light and starts their whole march towards their character arcs. Get a little bit more out of Chief O'Brien, even though this is the show that really started the O'Brien must suffer little thing. Introduces a lot of the other minor characters, and all in all, does a good job setting up the show. Now, there's better episodes later on, but for a pilot, Emissary, you can do worse, but one of those ones that you're going to have to be hard-pressed to find one that does it better. And definitely, if I were to recommend episodes from Star Trek, whether in general or from Deep Space Nine, this would definitely make the list. So next time we deal with Star Trek, it's going to be a Ferengi-centered episode, and it's going to be about offers that you can't refuse. Till next time, guys.